Hello, I'm Craig, and I recently just got back from my vacation in Antarctica. I wanted to make this video because I've had a lot of family and friends asking me how my trip went, and I didn't really have a good way to describe it to them other than showing them all the pictures and videos that I took while I was there. And this video is now basically a combination of all that. I figured the video might also be useful for other people thinking of traveling to Antarctica, but might be looking for that little bit of inspiration to pull the trigger. My advice, it's definitely worth it. A little bit pricey, but 100% worth it, and you're going to have an incredible time. So with that, I hope this video helps you out, and enjoy. So thanks for watching.
Now, before we get to Antarctica, we actually started our journey somewhere else. So Cathy and I are from Fort Saskatchewan in Alberta, Canada, so it's quite the journey to get down to Antarctica. Taking advantage of the flying, we actually started our trip in Rio de Janeiro. And in proper tourist fashion, the first thing you do when you hit Rio is check out Christ the Redeemer. And after battling the crowds there, we headed over to the Sugarloaf Mountains. Now, unfortunately, the rain and the wind really picked up once we got up top, but either way, we still had a really good time up there. The next day, we did a tour of the Rosina Favela. This was a really cool experience because it gave us an opportunity to see how people actually live in Rio de Janeiro. Now, whether or not you know anything about the favelas, this is basically where the drug lords live and control as well, so essentially you're going into their turf. So it wasn't too uncommon to walk by a table full of drugs or walk by a guy with a gun, for example. But that said, our tour guide made us feel really safe while we were there. We didn't have any issues at all. However, that said, on October 28th, 2025, the same day we toured that favela, a different favela across the city was raided by police and 120 people died. So, yeah. The next stop of our trip was in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Now, this was technically the first day of the Antarctica cruise, but we arrived a day early and ended up doing a city tour that day. One of the highlights for me that day was visiting the Recoleta Cemetery. It was crazy seeing how much money people spent on some of these tombs in here. Now, I'll be honest, we were only there for a day and I didn't take that many videos, so enjoy a couple photos instead. Alright, let's get down to business. You want to see Antarctica, that's why we're here, and that's where we're heading now. First step was boarding our chartered flight down to Ushuaia at the very southern tip of Argentina. When we arrived, we were given a couple hours to explore the town, which was beautiful, and shortly after we got to see the Fridtjof Nansen, and once we boarded, we were able to go check out our room for the next 10 days. I gotta say, our room was top notch. It was massive, the bathroom was big, shower was big. I've only ever been on 2 cruises, but I gotta give this one like 10 out of 10. There was a bottle of red wine, white wine, champagne, free of charge in the room, and if you drink it, they'll refill it for you. It was awesome. Not to mention, great views out the window. It didn't take us too long to get comfortable on the ship. A short while after that, we departed and started our 2.5-day journey across the Drake Passage towards Antarctica. With, well, nothing to do for the next 2.5 days, we decided to eat all the food, drink all the drinks, and take advantage of some of the wicked amenities on the ship. A lot of people were asking me how rough the ride was, because, as we know, the Drake Passage can be a little bit of a rough ride. Fortunately for us, we were gifted with what they call the Drake Lake, so what you're seeing here is pretty typical for what we had for 2.5 days, and we had about 5 to 6 meter high waves, which is calm, apparently. The best opportunity to catch some fresh air was to hang out on the top deck of the ship. Up top is where they had their 150-meter long walking/running track. And I found we spent a fair amount of time up here, walking, getting some exercise, enjoying the view, but I gotta say, I don't suggest running, it was slippery as hell. Up on the 10th deck is where you're gonna find the Explorer Lounge, where I found we spent a lot of our time. No matter where you're sitting in the bar, you're gonna have great views outside through the windows, fantastic service at the bar, and by far Cathy's favorite was the spinny chairs. A couple days into the trip, we start seeing some wildlife, as you can see the whale there, and a short while after that, we finally see land, and we get our first glimpse of what we've been waiting for, Antarctica. I didn't know it at the time, but this is the only other ship we saw for the next 7 days, so effectively the only other humans we saw for our entire trip. We spent the rest of that evening sailing towards our destination, and by the morning we had arrived at our first stop, Des Moines Point. And after some breakfast, we geared up and we were ready to make our first landing. This boat ride was probably like 3 minutes, but it felt like it took forever. We were so ready to finally touch Antarctica and stretch our sea legs out. And then finally, after spending days traveling halfway across the world, braving the Drake Passage, we finally get to touch land, which was extra special for Cathy and I because it was the last continent that we had to check off the bucket list. Did you know Antarctica has penguins? Well, there's a lot of them, and after spending some time getting to stare at these guys, we opted to pay a little bit extra and do a snowshoeing tour. Look, we're Canadian. Snowshoeing to us is really nothing special, but we did this tour because it gave us an opportunity to spend a little bit extra time on land. And when you're traveling halfway across the world with very limited time to spend on land, every bit extra is worth it. In saying that, yeah, I would recommend the tour. Des Moines Point's been home for many explorers over the last 100 years or so, starting in the early 1900s. It was pretty neat getting to explore their shelter and see how people would live for months and months on end, but at least they had a pretty great view. These two penguins are doing exactly what you think they're doing. After our snowshoeing tour, we were back to the boat where we briefly set sail for a few kilometers away towards Port Lockroy, where we were dropping off members of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, where they're going to be spending the next 6 months. Have fun! Now, day one turned out to be quite a big day. Other than snowshoeing, we also signed up for camping on the ice. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat the experience. Camping was pretty brutal. It was cold, expensive. We spent about 400 euros per person, and it was really hard to sleep. However, like I said earlier, more time on land, the better. And we got to spend an entire evening on land, making this experience worth it. While it's easy to complain about the money gone and the 45 minutes of sleep I got that night, the one thing you can't complain about was the amazing sunset we got to experience that evening. These people over here are camping in what's called a bivvy, which is basically like a tiny one-person tent compared to our great big tents over here. So again, hard to complain about the experience with what we had. Okay, rise and shine, we're back at it. After an early morning wake-up call in the tent, a quick bite to eat on the boat, we began our day by sailing through the beautiful Lemaire Channel. It took us about a half hour to get through the strait, just given with navigating through the ice being a little bit difficult, but the views the entire time were absolutely wonderful. This was probably one of the highlights of the trip for me. After sailing through the Lemaire Channel, we ended up at Plano Island. Here we got to spend some time with some more penguins and take the Zodiac boats out to the iceberg graveyard you can see behind us here. After spending a couple hours outside, we were back to the boat, had some supper, and of course, eventually ended back up on the spinny chairs. We spent a lot of the night sailing, and by the morning, we had arrived at Brown Station. What made Brown Station a little bit extra special was the fact that this is the first landing where we get to reach continental Antarctica. All the other landings we went to were the islands of Antarctica, but this is the time that we finally get to touch the big continent itself. Before we got to land though, we spent some time in the Zodiac boats, cruising around, checking out animals, checking out the big icebergs, and the absolutely massive glaciers in the area. Although nobody was home when we arrived, Brown Station is a pretty well-established scientific research station, and a lot of scientists do end up spending their entire summers down here. However, it wasn't always a scientific research station. In fact, in 1951, it began its life as a base for the Argentinian Navy. Fun fact though, in 1984, a doctor was ordered to stay at the base throughout the winter. However, he decided to burn the station down, saying you don't need a doctor at a station that doesn't exist anymore. So what you're actually seeing is the rebuilt version of Brown Station. After waving goodbye to Brown Station, we spent most of the evening sailing towards our next destination. I thought this was the perfect opportunity to take advantage of some of those free bottles of wine I was talking about earlier and watch the icebergs roll by out the window. We're now on day 6 of the trip and we are treated to some beautiful weather in Charlotte Bay. And because the weather was so good, we were able to do the add-on activity of sea kayaking. It was a pretty unique kayaking trip getting to navigate through all the icebergs. I think this tour costs us about 130 euros a person. I gotta say, if you get the opportunity, I highly recommend this tour. Being it was so hot out, one of the guys decided to cool off a little bit by taking a dip into the ocean. He wasn't the only one doing a dip that day though, and it was finally time for us to do the polar plunge. I think Cathy found this experience to be a little bit chilly, but I honestly thought it was super refreshing and I wanted to do a second lap, but they wouldn't let me. weather didn't stay nice all day though, and shortly after turned into cold and windy as we were heading towards our final destination. On day 7, we got to do our final landing, where we went to Telephone Bay in Deception Island. This landing was pretty unique, given that the rocks were fairly black and volcanic. Reason being, this is actually an active volcano. But even with that, there's lots of wildlife in the area, and certainly didn't stop these penguins from rolling up on shore for a visit. It was definitely bittersweet leaving Deception Island, sad knowing it was our final landing, but sweet being able to reflect on such an amazing journey that we had had so far. And with a wonderful way to say goodbye to the continent, we got to wave goodbye to a colony of chinstrap penguins and take in the incredible scenery of Neptune's Bellows as we left Deception Island. Of course, the trip's not over, as we still had another 2.5 days till we got to land, and here we got to thank the crew for the amazing job that they did making our trip so special. It also gave us an opportunity to set a new high speed in the spinny chair. All good things must come to an end, and soon enough we were back in Ushuaia, spending our final night aboard the ship.
Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it inspires you to one day go to Antarctica yourself. Thanks.